session is a human rights-based approach to planned relocation in the context of disasters and climate change. I'm delighted to have this panel here at the IOM Pavilion, and thanks so much to IOM for hosting the event. My name is Matthew Scott. I lead the Human Rights and Environment thematic area at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, and we have one of our thematic priorities within that area focusing on human mobility, including planned relocation. So it's a great pleasure to have the panelists here. I'm just going to open in 1 or 2 minutes to highlight what we're doing talking about planned relocation at COP. And I'll leave it to the panelists to do the rest, but we want a lot of time for you to ask questions. So start thinking about them as we go along. So we're situating this discussion on planned relocation within the broader space of climate-related human mobility. So often we'll hear that term referred to in the COP, and that refers to migration, displacement, and planned relocation. So planned relocation refers to several different things, and I don't think there's an international legal definition, but typically we're thinking about whole communities moving from one defined place to another defined place, typically with the assistance of a government, and in this space, in the context of disasters and climate change. This topic is relevant to a lot of the discussions happening within the COP, including on national adaptation plans, including on the global goal on adaptation, just transition discussions, amongst many others. And we'll hear a bit later about how this topic, specifically relating to planned relocation, fits within what's being decided here at the COP. Importantly, as the title of this session suggests, we're talking about a human rights-based approach to planned relocation. And I think that term, that concept of a human rights-based approach, requires some unpacking, especially for participants here and elsewhere who may not have an intimate familiarity with what a human rights-based approach is. So we're going to unpack that quite a bit in this session. I think that's enough of a framing from me. So apart from introducing the distinguished panel, and I'll work from left to right. First we have Paula Gaviria Betancourt, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. Then to her right, we have Lucy Martin, the tribal government representative from the native village of Quigilingok. Next to that is Dr. Erica Bauer, researcher on planned relocation at Human Rights Watch, and also still affiliated with Stanford University, where she wrote her PhD on planned relocation. And finally, we've got Lorenzo Guadagno, who is a program officer at the Platform on Disaster Displacement, looking specifically at human mobility and loss and damage. So without any more from me, we're going to do a series of Q&As with the panelists and then open up to the floor. So we're going to start with Paula. And Paula, what's interesting for this panel is the recent consultation that you've conducted on planned relocation and presented a report to the Human Rights Council just a few months ago. It would be a great way to start off our discussion to hear what you've learned from that global consultation process, and also what role human rights plays in that space. So over to you. You'll need a mic. Try it. You might have to speak into it, see if we can hear.
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Okay. So thank you, Matthew, and thank you all of the organizers. I feel very, very happy to be here with you, mainly, not at the COP, here
if you
with
can't hear, headphones in the back.
Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. So you already framed why we're here in this side event. And I would just like to say that for an increasing number of people around the world, disasters are leaving them with no viable option other than permanently leave the lands they have called homes for generations. So that's why we are finally talking about that here at the COP. So an increasing number of states are adopting national laws and policies to address planned relocations. And in light of this trend, both reality and the consequences that planned relocations can lead to impacts on human rights, and that states are adopting these laws and policies, we decided to encourage states to adopt a human rights-based approach to this process and present a report to the Human Rights Council, as you remind us all, Matthew, on planned relocations in the context of disasters and the adverse effects of climate change, informed by a broad consultation supported by our very good friends, the Platform on Disaster and Displacement, PDD, represented here by Lorenzo, and with the support of a friend, Erika, a very special expert on the topic. And we talked with civil society, some of them present here, academia, and other organizations based in Asia, the Pacific, the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And the biggest takeaway, I already mentioned this in the side event before this one, of this discussion, the biggest one, and from the experts, was that the first and foremost that planned relocation should be is a last resort. And that is completely stressed through and around the report. Highlighted, if I could, but stressed around the report. People want to stay in their homes or return after displacement, and they have a fundamental right to do so. Relocation should only be considered in exceptional circumstances when other options to protect their lives and health of communities from the impacts of disasters and the various effects of climate change are exhausted or become untenable. So states have a responsibility to invest then, consequently, in strengthening early warning, anticipatory action, and other disaster risk and reduction measures, as well as to invest in climate adaptation, mitigation measures in order to keep human settlements intact whenever possible. Secondly, meaningful, effective, safe participation of communities impacted by planned relocations, including both those to be relocated and communities that may already be living in areas of relocation. We found that was crucial, and we heard from the consultation that was crucial to long-term successful planned relocations. So from a human rights perspective, those to be relocated must be able to provide, as different norms say so, free, prior, and informed consent to such arrangements, and be able to shape, to define, to decide upon the process in accordance with their needs, their dreams, their aspirations. Communities impacted by relocation can also provide important practical cultural insights in the case of indigenous and particular cultural identity groups that, when applied, enable as well long-term success. We say that throughout the report. Participation is completely linked with the sustainability of those processes, with the success of those processes of relocation. But we saw as well, and we heard from different people consulted, that despite this imperative, participation and consultation continues to be underemphasized by policymakers and is not a practice, or when it is made, it is completely tokenistic and it minimizes the agency of the affected populations. It's just like part of a check. How do you say that? You check the box in the process. So many of the stakeholders I spoke with emphasized that planned relocations are, as I repeat, the exception, but are also exceptionally difficult a process to carry out, without adversely impacting the human rights of those relocated. It's almost always, there's always a risk to impact the human rights of those relocated, underscoring another reason why they should only be a last resort. It's very risky not to. It's very risky not to impact their human rights. Relocated communities may also lack adequate land rights. It's always we saw this this happening recurrently, and in the areas of relocation. They could be relocated to areas that are unsafe, that are insecure, or that lack healthcare, education, housing, or housing that is not culturally appropriate regarding their own identities. And planned relocation also disrupts the practice of communities' traditional livelihoods and can be especially detrimental for indigenous peoples who often possess a deep relationship, maybe Lucy can talk about that, a deep relationship to their lands, meaning that relocation may permanently affect their spiritual and cultural practices and even their sense of identity. So governance challenges are also an issue with many of relocation processes impacted by indefinite delays or lack of adequate adequate financial resources. We also saw that when there were like good practices put in place, there are not enough sustained financial support in the processes. So these challenges elucidate some of the ways in which planned relocations implemented without appropriate resources and that human rights safeguards can devolve, and this is very important and also highlighted in the report, can devolve, and I mentioned it in the past side event, can devolve into a process that most likely resembles arbitrary displacement. And this is very, very important to highlight. So planned relocations that are carried out without free, prior, informed consent, and those of those affected, and those that fail to provide remedy, compensation for losses incurred during the relocation, or that leave those relocated worse off than they were before, can resemble or can constitute internal displacement. So we give a set of recommendations that I don't have the time to go through them. It's listed in the report, underlining what I said. That state, I would just mention this one, that states must have compelling reasons, strong evidence, and sound legal basis for planned relocations that should be, as I said, last resort after all other risk reductions and adaptation measures have recently been stated as exhausted. And then, when implemented with a rights-based approach, with the consent and the participation of the people involved, I also state that they could be a good pathway for durable solutions. That's another important message that is part of the report that obviously I recommend you all to read. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. And the report that you refer to, we have a link to it, but it's not on the screen. I'm going to put business cards here with a QR code, and that's going to link you to a space where you can see that report as well as other key reports that we've got assembled on planned relocation for this panel. Thank you so much. Now we're going to move to an actual situation where planned relocation is in the process. And there we have Lucy Martin from Quigilingok. And Lucy, can you tell us more about what led to the decision of the community to relocate? And just in your own words, tell us what's going on there and how does it look when what we're talking about sometimes abstractly becomes a reality for a particular community having to move?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel. The reason why our community decided to relocate.
Can people hear okay? more into the mic.
Okay. So the reason why our community decided to relocate, we're calling it managed retreat because we're not moving far away from our current village. We're calling it a managed retreat because we're just moving farther up into higher grounds away from the eroding river. Permafrost is thawing. Right now there is absolutely no permafrost underneath our village. It's causing the land to sink. It's more wetlands now. We're not able to walk on ground with just shoes because it's wet. And because the land is sinking, water is rising, increasing flood. Right now, at this moment, as I'm speaking, my village is flooding with ocean water and ice. So it can be very intense, especially for those who are not from my small Arctic cold village. There is erosion happening along the river, so the river is widening. They are threatening infrastructures, including our one and only airstrip. The river is just touching our airstrip now. So our community as a whole, through public meetings, made a motion to move our village. But I know it's going to take a long time for it to actually happen because there are steps that we need to take from planning to actually making it happen.
Can you give us a little bit more detail, even, about the kinds of considerations when we're talking about planned relocation? There's one big question about where you might be moving to, and how is that playing out when it comes to land title or even just designating a place for the community to move from A to B? Is there an identified place already?
There are a few options. We look at tundra, and we look at access to the river. So by using maps, we propose sites to the whole community during public meetings, and it is up to the public as a whole, as one. You know, it's not just a group of people who decide, it's the whole town needs to agree in order to move. And we have to consider operation lands. We have to consider native allotments, because there are natives who own land. So we have to have those identified to prevent roadblocks.
So it's an incredibly complex process that has some tensions associated with it.
Yes.
And it's going to take time.
Yes.
Yeah, so some key dimensions there, time and community decision making. But also it sounds like leaving no one behind as well. We've heard in a previous panel on planned relocation that sometimes older people have such an attachment to land that they don't want to go. But in Quigelingok, the community moves as a whole through a collective decision.
Yes.
Erica, this is a good shift because thank you so much, Lucy, for sharing that, and we'll open for questions when we're finished, and I'm sure people want to know more. But Erica, you've looked at planned relocation processes all over the world, and it's probably not wrong to suggest that often they fail. Can you draw on your insights from the cases that you've examined to help us to understand what is it about this process that so often results in failure, what failure might look like in that context as well, and maybe the flip side, what are the ingredients of success and how human rights law might play a role in that.
Thank you.
A mouthful.
No, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Paola. It's really an honor to be here, and also thank you to
Can people hear okay?
Can everyone hear? So this question of measuring success, measuring outcomes of a relocation is extraordinarily complex. There are so many dimensions, as we've just heard, and it more often than not involves elements of loss of livelihoods, loss of culture, loss of connection to place that people have called home for hundreds of years. Planned relocations, as we've heard, are far from straightforward, and more often than not, communities face serious threats to their rights before, during, and after the move. But as planned relocations become more common, it's essential that we learn from the past to better plan for the future. Planned relocations are already happening in Alaska and indeed around the world. With the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the Caldor Center, and IOM, we mapped over 400 of these community-wide moves across all inhabited continents. This is the current reality. And according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's likely to occur more as climate change accelerates. For that reason, we must ask precisely this question: what leads to comparatively more successful rights-respecting relocations? I've spent the last 6 years thinking about this question through doctoral research, through work with the PDD global mapping, and also work with indigenous communities in Panama and the Solomon Islands through Human Rights Watch. But everything I share today builds on decades of work from Robin Bronin and from many others, and I'd encourage lots of you to refer to the toolbox and the guidance that are provided in the QR codes, which Matt will share later today, to get a comprehensive sense of all of the complex factors that lead to more successful outcomes. I want to share two key lessons, two key ingredients, if you will, about what might lead to better outcomes. The first, as we've already heard from Lucy, is community leadership. In a systematic meta-analysis of 14 completed flood-related planned relocations, we found that when communities themselves make the decisions about whether to move, when to move, where to move, how to move, better outcomes ensue. Governments or NGOs will never know what people are experiencing as well as communities. So communities must be at the center of these challenging decision-making processes. Of course, this finding is not surprising to any of you. Indeed, the right to participation, consultation, and for Indigenous communities, the right to self-determination is the bread and butter of a human rights-based approach to planned relocation. But community leadership alone, in a vacuum of government support, is perhaps also not the answer. Consider some of the challenges that we've heard about in Alaska and in many other country contexts. So, second main ingredient, main lesson, is that there needs to be adequate, substantive, financial and technical support about so much more than just housing. Beyond houses and infrastructure, a relocation site should ensure rights to an adequate standard of living, to prioritize sustainable livelihoods and preservation of cultural identity. Financial and technical support should therefore prioritize culturally appropriate homes, ceremonial halls, cultural centers, whatever efforts the communities identified to ensure that traditions are not lost in this process. So a comprehensive human rights respecting approach to planned relocation requires both strong community leadership and adequate support from governments and, if needed, international actors. Consider an example of a case that was truly community-led at all stages and where the government in the end came through with support. The Guna indigenous community of Gardi-Sagdeb in Panama, and unfortunately he's just left, but there was a representative of the Guna community who's here with us today. 1,300 people are living on an island that was the size of 5 football fields, where floods and sea level rise encroached on a space where there was already no land for children to play or new families to build homes. Just this past May, they moved to their new mainland site called Isperyala after decades of community-led dreaming, planning, mobilization. It wasn't perfect and many obstacles arose, but the government of Panama came through and fulfilled many of their promises. Now they've moved, and I asked the question that Matt asked earlier. Was this a success? What will happen over time? Will people stay in this new site? Will they be safer? Will they be able to lead more dignified lives? Will they perceive this move to be just in 5 years and 10 years? What about those who remain on the island and are disproportionately elderly? They've now lost their caretakers. What will happen to them? Only time will tell. The government of Panama is now learning lessons from this case and contemplating developing a national policy on planned relocation. For Panama and for many other nations, human rights frameworks are powerful tools for policy development and implementation, as Paula and others have already illustrated so eloquently. But there are some contexts where human rights are seen as Western constructs with their focus on individual rather than the collective. There's also some policy domains where rights-based approaches are just less common. In disaster risk reduction perspectives, for example, the concept of being rights-based is sometimes translated to being people-centered. Regardless, the principles hold value, whatever your terminology. Whether it's rights language or not, policies should uphold the principles of informed consent, ensuring people can move or stay on their own terms and with dignity. Principles of non-discrimination, so that all are treated equally in this process, and that people's basic rights are protected at all stages of the planned relocation. As a final thought here, I would argue there's a dual imperative for human rights protections in this context. To support communities that want to move through advocating for rights-respecting policies and funding mechanisms, to support communities that want to do this with dignity, but also to support communities that want to stay but are being forcibly displaced in government-led relocations, whether it's a climate adaptation narrative that's being used to mask a land seizure for development or tourism or speculation. So in both of these cases, regardless of whether people want to stay or want to go, we need to promote this principle of informed consent, ensuring people can stay or move with dignity, and also to ensure there's greater transparency and accountability across the board. Time is of the essence. As climate change accelerates, the window of time in which we can learn what makes planned relocation processes and outcomes more rights-respecting is quickly shrinking. The Special Rapporteur's report and this side event are important steps towards building this evidence base, but more work is needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for your research and the clarity there. You started by talking about loss, and it makes sense to use that as a segue to Lorenzo, who can help us to situate planned relocation within the wider COP processes, including loss and damage, but also other contexts. Can you take it away for us, Lorenzo?
Thank you, Matt. I'll try. But I really want to stress that there are a number of elements that you were all relating that are incredibly relevant for the discussions that are being had in the other rooms down the corridor this week and the next week, right? The reason why planned relocation, along with other human mobility elements, so displacement and migration, is part of these discussions, is primarily linked in principle with adaptation, right? That's where we're coming from through the Cancun adaptation framework originally. However, we have really seen a shift of the discourse over the last few years, and in particular since Paris with Article 8, towards anchoring a lot of this discussion under the loss and damage track. And I think this makes particular sense for planned relocation. We are discussing planned relocation as a last resort option where all other adaptation in situ is exhausted, right? So that's exactly the definition of loss and damage fundamentally. When we are beyond adaptation, where the impacts are felt on communities, then we are in loss and damage territory. On the other side, we've heard Erica saying planned relocations often fail, they're not successful. And we've heard from both the other speakers how much they can infringe on people's human rights, whether they are well done or not, or rather wherever they are situated on the scale of well done to relatively poorly done, right? They are always infringing on human rights. They are always leading, in another perhaps closer to this forum terminology, they are always leading to loss and damage. There is always something that is lost through planned relocation, even in the best in the most participated, in the best planned relocation, we are in loss and damage territory. There are impacts that are inevitable and that are just linked with the move, and there are elements of loss of territory, loss of identity, that are the definition of non-economic losses and damages that really are being discussed as part of this loss and damage architecture. So I would really like to focus on the loss and damage side of this, even though clearly there are elements of this that are relevant to the adaptation discussion and have been relevant for the adaptation discussion for over 10 years, despite the fact that we basically have not seen assistance come through the adaptation finance architecture and the adaptation support architecture for planned relocation. So I think loss and damage is where this discussion should be right now, and it's also potentially a more productive structure to support some of these actions. And planned relocation are really relevant to all elements of the loss and damage architecture. Right? We have the finance arm with the newly established fund for responding to loss and damage with all the funding arrangements. We have the technical assistance arm with the Santiago network, and we have the policy side with the WIM-EXCOM and these discussions that are rather like among governments and are going to stay among governments. And planned relocation really matters for all of these. Finance, it's clearly a major concern. These are extremely expensive endeavors, and they are even more expensive if we want to make them right? Participation costs money. Infrastructure and housing costs money. Adding the trainings, livelihoods, skills, capacity building, you're amplifying costs to probably a level that is unsustainable for local communities, for national governments in the most vulnerable countries as well. We've just supported an analysis of 40 of your planned relocation cases from the finance point of view, and we're seeing that in most vulnerable countries, there is a much larger share of the finance that's coming from local or community sources. Basically, the countries that need more resources in order to be supported with planned relocation are not getting them. And that means that there is a finance gap that is being borne by communities mostly. That means more loss and damage, right? And again, if we start integrating the non-economic costs of all these, then we are in unquantified and probably even higher figures. This is important for technical assistance because, as you have articulated, depending on how we do these things, losses and damages that communities suffer are going to be vastly different. They can mitigate it, they can be prevented, they can be addressed or not. So having a solid technical assistance systems in place around this topic and supporting that technical assistance through, in particular, the Santiago Network X activities is going to be a major part of what the loss and damage architecture at global level can actually do for countries and communities. So how do we support these processes that are initiated by communities or countries through technical assistance requests? That's going to be a major issue. That also, in a way, begs the question of understanding how we're going to be able to grant access to these processes to the communities that are actually requesting relocations, right? Both in terms of technical assistance and in terms of finance. Is it going to be exclusively government initiated? Can communities actually get a sort of immediate access to these forms of support? That's the second one. In terms of policy, we've heard how important it is that there is an institutional framework that supports these movements at community level. That's the role that institutions that are working around the WIM-EXCOM, for instance, could potentially do under this space. It's about standard setting. It's about exchanges of practices across countries. It's about making sure that there are clear guidelines on how to do these things from the government to the community level. And this is something where the expert groups that are under the WIM-EXCOM, the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, can actually work. This is the type of inputs that we can get from these structures. So I would really think as we move into a more articulated loss and damage architecture at global level, this is the type of concrete action that we need to be able to support. And we need to be able to support it comprehensively through standards, through technical assistance, and through finance in order to be able to avert, minimize, and address the losses and damages that are going to be associated with this movement for communities of origin, for communities of destination, for the people moving, and for broader societies at large.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I'm holding back my own comments to make way for the floor. If we have questions, I can see one already. I think we might do rounds of 2. So I've got 2 straight away, and then we'll do more. We've got 25 minutes, so it's good time to talk. In the front, maybe I'll be the mic guy too.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Sophie Tidler. I'm from Alaska. Lucy, it's so good to see you. I've been missing the Alaska representation. It's been scaring me not to see what I would say are the most critically threatened in the U.S. I work for the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, but right now I'm a law student. And okay, so if we don't get this right, what happens to the rest? That's a direct quote from someone from New Talk. And I don't have the answers for how to get this right, but something that I'm focused on is, I guess, how especially Alaskans use the land. It's a subsistence use of land, and I've been to over 30 communities. Last summer I went to 8 of the most threatened, and you can't unsee a landfill that is entering into the ocean that is a mile down from the drying racks where the seal and the fish are drying, and you just see how the whole ecosystem is connected and the health is threatened. And so I just want to put my plug in that decommissioning these villages that are entering into the waters and contaminating the lands needs to be part of the discussion as well.
Thank you. Yeah, just pass the mic back, and people will be able to respond after. Sam Huckstep.
Yes, that's right. Good to see you again, Matt. So I'm Sam Huckstep of the Centre for Global Development, and thanks so much for a really interesting discussion. I wanted to ask about what comes upstream from planned relocation, because planned relocation obviously must be community-driven and community-requested, but we know that also it is a last resort, and it's the result of inadequate adaptation in the decades that precede it. And we know also that adaptation funding is hugely limited, and that in some contexts like the Marshall Islands, for example, there's already a recognition that there will need to be time-delineated periods in which some communities are identified that cannot be adapted because the resources are too limited. And so the context in which the relocations are being requested are also ultimately being set by quite top-down decisions which happen in very different contexts at several levels away regarding the allocation of adaptation resources, cost-benefit analyses, and everything that goes into planning where you put your money. So how do you think those two facts should be reconciled? The need for community requests and community-led relocations, and also this fact of quite a hierarchical adaptation planning process? And how should planned relocation be incorporated into the wider scope of adaptation funding allocation? Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks for both of those questions/comments. Lucy, do you want to go ahead first, and then others who've got responses can take it from there?
Thank you for asking that question. So for my village in Alaska of Kugilgak, our community looked at food because we live a subsistence lifestyle. We don't just go to the grocery store and buy something to cook or something to eat. We have to work hard for our food. We go hunting and we go fishing and we walk on the tundra to gather our food and store it away for the winter. We do not take more than what we need. We take enough to last us the whole winter. So for our community, it's the food, the fish, everything that we eat that will help us survive year after year.
Thanks, Lucy. Other people wanting to reflect on Sam's question or the question from the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium? There was a question on adaptation finance, for instance.
This is a really tough question, and it's extremely context specific. It also depends very much on the type of hazards that you're facing and to what extent the type of degradation that they are associated with is or not irreversible, is or not to some extent mitigated through those interventions. So I don't think there is a unique answer. I can give you one example of the work that we are supporting with the Fiji government. I'm sure you know enough about Fiji and about their planned relocation structure at the institutional level, but they basically are supporting a series of community-initiated relocations whereby at least I think 90% of the community has to request the relocation before they kind of consider them. But they also have a kind of a government-developed list of relocation hotspots, right, of priority communities that need to be relocated. And then something that Erica actually has helped develop very much is a decision-making tool around that relocation that looks at thresholds of risk in the place where people are and whether those thresholds of risk currently and under climate change scenarios justify a relocation. And then thresholds of risk also in the areas where relocation potentially can take place. And that is what gives you the baseline of cost-benefit analysis. So understanding how much communities might be affected in where they are, understanding whether there are mitigation options for disasters in the place where the community currently is located, and understanding then what are the potential options where community might be relocated and what that in terms of costs and potential benefits entails. Clearly, again, it depends very much on the scenario that we're looking at. I think the cases that we worked on in Fiji were primarily sudden onset events linked with floods, with landslides. And so if you are facing irreversible degradation of the ecosystems, then it's probably a completely different type of site. So for us, it was more a matter, I think, of risk tolerance in the face of sudden onset events that are probably also a little bit easier in a way to mitigate with some of these interventions in a successful manner. But perhaps you can articulate based on what you've heard.
No, I thought that was an extremely helpful answer. I learned a lot from listening to you, Lorenzo. No, I think it's not an either or. It's a both and, right? It's how do you ensure community-led solutions and at the same time have government top-down prioritization of limited resources in a way that's aligned with community needs. And that might involve planning at a national scale, looking at indices and ranking sometimes in problematic ways, all the different challenges that occur, all the different hazard types. One thing I'll add to what Lorenzo shared is that we lack criteria for truly understanding what is a measure of last resort in context, for truly evaluating every adaptation mechanism in place, whether it's building a seawall or putting homes on stilts, and systematically going through all of those options. I think this measure of last resort principle is so important, and yet we still lack concrete technical advice and methodologies for how to implement it in practice.
Since you mentioned the Marshall Islands, I just recently came back from the Marshall Islands. And so I just wanted to mention that things that you can start doing, for example, is what they are starting to do, which is a very sensitive issue because there's this situation about the owning of the land with the traditional landowners because it's owned by the traditional with the traditional indigenous population, and there's this risk of when relocations need to be done because of the king tides. It's difficult because they cannot do it in certain places because of the owning of the land. So they're doing it in schools, which is not safe, and school stops, well, everything that you know happens in other places. So they're starting to do this sensitization with the landowners, so it's something that you can start doing because it's a barrier, and it comes in conflict with different rights. It's not to change the system, but it's to also adapt and try to prevent when things had to happen, you are prepared and have answers for what needs to be done. Just to refer to the Marshall Islands in particular.
Oh, I don't. I'll pause. I've got two more on the list, but I want to abuse my position as chair to also come back on the decommissioning point, not in a way that's sort of especially informed about decommissioning, except that I know that it's often overlooked, and there's a human rights dimension, at least in two contexts in here. The one relates to the right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment. You talk about landfill going into the water. The landfill that's polluting the water doesn't end up just in one place that's been abandoned, but goes downstream and has health implications on fish stocks or other animals in the water, as well as people fishing and things like that. So there's an intimate human-nature relationship that's reflected in this recently recognized right to a healthy environment that helps us to ask relevant questions across the spectrum of starting to make decisions about whether we need to go, what are the criteria for determining that, all the way through to the questions about decommissioning. So it's a point that I really want to emphasize coming out of this panel, that sometimes you might think that you're going to come away from this panel thinking this is just so big we can't even start to deal with it. And that's disheartening and disempowering. And a human rights-based approach is not going to provide the answers, but I think it's important to emphasize that it will help us to ask relevant questions. And it provides this systematic framework for thinking consistently across the different dimensions. And Erica mentioned a number of them: non-discrimination, not just the right to shelter, but the right to adequate health, the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and a host of others that the human rights framework gives us to help us to think about complexity, human dignity, and tensions between different actors and different communities. But I'm the moderator. So we had a first question over here to the gentleman with the laptop. You had a question, and then we've got Robert in the back. And then we'll get you next round. We'll have... can't hear it.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I can hear myself as well. My name is Israel Bailongandi. I'm from DRC, and I'm a IOM COP29 youth delegate, and I'm really happy to be here in this panel. I'm really interested with the report from the findings that you have. So my concern is much about the negative impact of relocation, of migration, of vulnerable people, mainly people with disabilities, because them having a specific need, while we are also doing a humanitarian response, we need to take into account those vulnerabilities and those specificities. So I just want to know if in the report, I'm waiting for the key code to scan and to read more about the report. But if you have found something around that, you can share with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Robert Oakes from United Nations University. So I like this idea of last resort. It's agreed upon, really important. Then I was thinking, Erica, you have this idea of trying to work out what is the last resort and having some sort of indicator, or for want of a better term, we'll use that, for what is that, for what the last resort looks like. And I can understand that in a technical or physical sense that is quite possible, hypothetically, salinity, level of water, etc. But what about, the level of last resort in people's heads and their subjective perception? And I'd like to link it to this idea how in your process in Alaska you came to a consensus decision. Maybe you could just explain how that happened, and if you think it's possible. Is it only like in the context within your community that it was able to be a community decision that everyone went along with, or maybe that wouldn't work in other situations?
So we had a first question, I think, specifically for Paula. You want to take that one first, and then we can go to the next question.
Yeah,
Robert.
basically, there's some references to people with disabilities and how this impacts their access to services, their lack of support from caregivers, obviously the lack of consultation, their disconnect with their networks from the places where they were before. So there has to be a real effort in the new places for them to be part of that society and to be able to access and to be like functional in all their capacities in order to be able to enjoy their human rights with dignity and as they deserve. So there's some mentions on that. But you made me think of Mozambique. That was another visit another mission that I did, and I found a lot of people with disabilities in the relocation place that I visited, and they were by themselves. And people not only with physical disabilities but with mental disabilities left completely by themselves, with no network support, with no family support. So also that's one of the impacts that happen. They are relocated, but left by themselves with no network or family support. And that's one of the recommendations also that's giving family unity as one of the main rights in planned relocations. Family unit is like one of the structural rights that should be regarded when planned relocations are done with a rights-based approach.
I can just add on the disability rights front. Recently, I was working with a community in the Solomon Islands where in the evacuation that preceded the planned relocation, a tropical cyclone came and it was the middle of the night and they were trying to figure out how to get everyone from their island into canoes to get onto the mainland. And in that struggle, people with disabilities were left behind. They weren't the first ones to get into the canoes, and they were later able to come back and make sure that these members of their community were able to move to safety. But I think that just illustrates the importance of the point you raised of making sure that people with disabilities' rights are front and center in these processes, and also that in planned relocation sites, their need for access to services is prioritized. I'll end there.
So that your question was about the whole community and how the community as a whole decides to relocate. So in Alaska's communities, there can be, like in my village, there's only 360 people. So everybody knows everybody. The biggest villages that I know are about 1,200 people. But my village is a small village, so everybody knows everybody. And then in these public meetings in our community, everybody has a chance to have their say in deciding which parts of our land might be feasible to relocate to. And that's how those options were decided. So we have a plan A, option B. If this is not feasible, we can go here. But we still need scientific studies to make sure those areas are feasible. And like I mentioned before, we follow our food. Where we go hunting, where we go fishing, we make sure that we have access to those locations so that our people can survive.
Thanks. I will hold back on my comment because I've got two more already. There was one here, and then Jocelyn. Oh yeah, we've got a mic coming. I just can't resist making the connection to the Sustainable Development Goals in this very express context of people being literally left behind. There's all of this sloganeering about leave no one behind, but really this is a kind of context where it really means that, and that highlights the importance of having mechanisms in place before those kind of events happen. So anyway, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Michele from Wageningen University, and the question is for whoever wanted to answer this. And it is about how do we reconcile official top-down risk assessment that lead to plan relocation, particularly in preventive relocation, when at the same time the community has a different perception of risk. And then if we don't do anything and something bad happens, who is to be held responsible? Because I have some example in the work that I've done where local authorities will say, we're going to move these people because it's the only thing that we can do and we don't want to be responsible for any deaths. So how do we go about that? Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Jocelyn Perry with Refugees International and Oxford University. And if you'll allow me, I'll ask a question from kind of both of those hats. So from the refugee side, how are we thinking about inclusion of communities like refugees and other internally displaced persons who are displaced for political reasons or other insecurity, and then facing the impacts of climate change in the place they have been moved to or where they're displaced to? As they're often left out of the political processes and adaptation planning processes of a country that is not necessarily their own, or if it is their own, they're often from marginalized communities within it. And what frameworks we should be thinking about for their inclusion and advocacy. And then kind of on the other side of things, from a scale issue, you're mentioning your community is quite small, and so everyone is able to have to participate in the discussions, which you can do when you know everyone in your community and there's 100 or 200 people. But I'm wondering when we start, well, we're already seeing the effects in large cities, but when we start seeing large cities being unlivable in some areas, how are we thinking about scaling these processes in a way that is inclusive of communities that are also often the most marginalized and also already living in the sort of least habitable areas of cities, and designing inclusive processes that are also somewhat feasible with the finances and political processes that we have at our disposal. Thank you.
This is kicking off a great discussion that's got about 2 minutes left to
Sorry.
go. So it's at your liberty to answer briefly.
I will answer as briefly as I can. I think that's a brilliant question, and it very much relates to the one that Rob Oakes just asked as well. There are so many times where there is dispute and contention between the top-down risk assessment and the community perception of what is habitable. In the guidance and toolbox that I referred to earlier, it underscores the importance of communities having access and the right to contest if they disagree with a top-down assessment. I think creating dialogue spaces for those differing perspectives on what is a last resort, what is habitable, is essential to navigate this. Jocelyn, those are also amazing questions. I would love to have longer to respond. But I think I'll just stop and we can have those conversations bilaterally.
I'll take the second half of Jocelyn's maybe, and I just have an impression if we are scaling up these efforts, then this is going to be left to the market basically and to regulations, and it's going to be way more dependent on individual capacities and preferences than on a collective scheme and government assistance. So I think that in those cases there is some elements that the government can assist with in terms of fiscal policies, for instance, incentives to move from one place to the next and try to encourage or discourage some patterns of settlement, some almost spontaneous type of migration. But I don't think we have necessarily examples of city-wide, million people-wide processes like this that actually work. There is one, perhaps, I think World Bank funded grant now with in Senegal, where they are moving an urban community, but it's part of a much larger community. So they are still thinking relatively low level, and they are putting, I think, 30 million into that, something like that. I can confirm that. But so I think it becomes complicated, and I think the mechanisms that we are discussing probably are not going to be adequate for that type of considerations.
We also discussed in the report the question around when a planned relocation is well done with the right-based approach, with all the messages that we send in this panel, do people still keep the right to go back if the conditions for going back are given? And they do. So I just wanted to finish with that also.
Anything last from you, Lucy? You're good. Okay, thank you, everybody. This is a panel that is impossible to sum up, but I think if I try, I would say we're just getting started. So both in terms of the discussion, Jocelyn's last point about scale that Lorenzo started talking about, we need to work on this a lot more, both from academic and policy and practice perspectives. I hope that we've communicated also the relevance of a human rights-based approach in this context, whether you call it human rights law or whether you base it on the principles of participation, free, prior, and informed consent, thinking about the relevant rights that are impacted. We just need to vacate the platform, but also keep the discussion going in other contexts. So thank you so much for coming and participating, and see you again soon. And don't forget, if you want the literature, it's on these QRs.